Hey there. What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this, entire cities, fleets of ancient warships, and the ruins of civilizations that shaped our world are just sitting on the ocean floor? Not lost, not destroyed, just waiting. Hidden under billions of tons of water we've never properly looked through until now. We're talking about a 5,000-year-old fleet of royal ships buried in the Egyptian desert. A Roman Vegas, now completely underwater. A battle that decided the fate of the ancient world, and we found the weapons on the seafloor to prove it. Sonar, LiDAR, photogrammetry. Modern tech is basically giving us X-ray vision into the deep, and what we're finding is rewriting history. Not tweaking it, rewriting it. So here's what we're doing. Across this series, we're draining the oceans, episode by episode, civilization by civilization. From the Minoans to the Vikings to the Maya, nothing stays hidden. Before we dive in though, drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I genuinely want to know. Let's picture this. You're an archaeologist. You're standing in the middle of the Egyptian desert, 6 miles from the Nile, surrounded by nothing but sand, heat, and the very real question of why your career choices led you here. And then your ground-penetrating radar starts going absolutely haywire. Not because of a tomb, not because of a hidden chamber filled with gold, but because buried beneath your feet, in a place that hasn't seen a single drop of water in thousands of years, are boats. 14 of them, just sitting there, in the sand. As if some ancient Egyptian woke up one morning and thought, you know what this desert really needs? A fleet. Welcome to Abydos, one of the oldest and most sacred cities in all of ancient Egypt. Long before the pyramids at Giza became the postcard image of this civilization, Abydos was the spiritual heartbeat of the entire culture. This was the city where Egypt's first rulers chose to be buried, where the earliest royal tombs were carved into the earth, and where the foundations of Egyptian religion were quite literally laid in the ground. And it turns out those foundations included a rather impressive navy that never touched water a single day in its afterlife. The fleet discovered at Abydos dates back roughly 5,000 years, which puts it squarely in the era of Egypt's very first dynasties, the period when the idea of a unified Egyptian state was still fresh off the press. These weren't small ceremonial boats you could carry around on your shoulder. These were massive wooden vessels, each one stretching up to 75 feet in length, built from planks of wood that were carefully lashed together with rope and sealed with bundles of reeds. Real, functional, seaworthy ships, the kind that could have sailed the Nile with an actual crew on board. And someone decided to bury all 14 of them in the desert, not accidentally, not lazily, but with extraordinary deliberate care, each boat sealed inside its own mud brick enclosure, lined up in a neat row, pointing toward the east as if they were waiting to set sail at a moment's notice. The question, naturally, is why? And the answer takes us deep into the Egyptian understanding of death, the afterlife, and what a powerful ruler was going to need once he got there. The ancient Egyptians were, to put it mildly, extremely invested in what happened after you died. Not in a vague, hopeful, maybe something good awaits us kind of way. No, they had plans, detailed, architectural, logistical plans. The afterlife wasn't some abstract spiritual destination. It was a place with geography, with rivers, with landscapes that mirrored the world of the living, and at the center of that world flowed the celestial Nile, a cosmic version of the river that gave Egypt its life. To travel through the afterlife, to rise with the sun each morning and journey across the sky, the ruler needed a boat. Actually, he needed several. Because the afterlife, much like running an empire, apparently required a robust transportation infrastructure. The pharaoh whose burial complex these ships were found near is believed to be one of Egypt's earliest kings, a ruler from the very first or second dynasty, a time so early in Egyptian history that we're still piecing together who these people even were. What we do know is that this ruler commanded enough power, enough resources, and enough devoted followers to organize one of the most elaborate funerary preparations ever attempted in human history up to that point. Building 14 full-sized wooden ships, transporting them 6 miles through the desert, and burying them in carefully constructed enclosures was not a weekend project. This was a statement. A declaration that whoever lay in that tomb nearby was not just a king. He was a being who would continue to rule in the next life, and he would do it in style, with a fleet that would make any other dead ruler deeply envious. What makes the Abydos boats particularly extraordinary isn't just their age, though 5,000 years is the kind of number that should make your brain briefly malfunction. It's the condition they were found in. The desert, that merciless, blazing, life-draining desert that was seemingly the worst possible place to bury a fleet of wooden ships, turned out to be the best possible preservation environment imaginable. The dry sand locked out moisture. The sealed mud brick chambers protected the wood from insects and temperature swings, and the sheer remoteness of the site kept looters and builders and generally curious humans away for millennia. When archaeologists first uncovered these vessels, they found wood that was still largely intact, planks that had been cut, shaped, and fitted together 5,000 years ago, still holding their form. It's the kind of discovery that makes you stop and appreciate the accidental genius of burying things in a desert. But here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating rather than just impressively old. The discovery of the Abydos fleet fundamentally shifted how historians understand the origins of Egyptian religious belief, specifically the belief in resurrection and the journey of the soul after death. For a long time, the assumption was that these complex ideas about the afterlife developed gradually, reaching their most sophisticated form in the later dynasties when the great temples were built and the elaborate funerary texts were written down. The pyramids, the Book of the Dead, the entire magnificent apparatus of Egyptian death culture, these seemed like the product of centuries of slow theological development. The boats blew that theory apart. Because here, in one of the earliest royal burials ever found, was already a fully formed concept of the afterlife that required a fleet of ships to navigate. The celestial Nile wasn't a late addition to Egyptian theology. It was there from the very beginning, baked into the culture before the pyramids were even a twinkle in an architect's eye. The idea that a ruler's soul would travel through the sky on water, that death was not an ending but a departure requiring proper nautical equipment, this wasn't something that evolved slowly over centuries of philosophical debate. It arrived in Egyptian civilization essentially fully formed, as far back as we can currently see, which means the first Egyptians we know anything about were already operating with a complete and elaborate picture of cosmic geography. Not bad for people who hadn't invented writing yet. The logistics alone are staggering. Think about what it takes to build 14 large wooden ships. You need timber, which doesn't exactly grow in abundance in the Egyptian desert, meaning it had to be sourced, transported, and carefully worked. You need skilled craftsmen who understood hull design, planking techniques, and the structural demands of a vessel that could handle open water. You need rope makers, reed gatherers, the whole supply chain of early shipbuilding. And then you need to move the finished products 6 miles overland through sand and bury them in precisely aligned enclosures. All of this for ships that would never float on actual water. If that seems like an absurd use of resources, you have to understand that from the Egyptian perspective, it was the opposite of wasteful. These ships were an investment, a long-term infrastructure project for the eternal reign of their king. A pharaoh without boats in the afterlife was like a modern executive showing up to a board meeting without a phone, a laptop, or any idea what Wi-Fi is. Technically present, functionally useless. The boats weren't a luxury, they were a necessity. The fact that they were burying perfectly good ships in the sand was a feature, not a bug. The craftsmanship visible in the surviving wood also tells us that Egyptian shipbuilding technology in this early period was far more advanced than previously assumed. The planks were shaped with precision, fitted together using a technique called lashing, where rope is threaded through holes drilled near the edges of the planks and pulled tight to bind them together. It sounds simple, but executing it well requires an understanding of how wood moves, how rope behaves under tension, and how water pressure distributes across a hull. These weren't people experimenting with boats for the first time. They were working within an established tradition of maritime craftsmanship that must have developed over generations before these particular ships were ever built. Which raises an obvious question. Where did that tradition come from? Egypt sits on the Nile, yes, and river travel has always been central to Egyptian life. But building ships of this scale and sophistication suggests contact with the sea, experience with conditions beyond the gentle currents of a river. Some researchers believe these early Egyptians were engaged in maritime trade along the Red Sea coast, long before the historical record makes it fully clear, and that the shipbuilding knowledge embedded in the Abydos fleet reflects a seafaring culture that we're only beginning to understand. The desert, in other words, was hiding not just boats, but an entire chapter of early Egyptian maritime history that nobody suspected was there. The site of Abydos itself adds another layer to all of this. For the Egyptians, Abydos wasn't just a convenient burial location, it was considered the threshold of the underworld, the physical boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. Burying the royal fleet here wasn't arbitrary. It was placing the ships at the exact point where the king would make his transition, right at the doorway between one existence and the next. The boats were positioned to launch from the edge of the living world directly into the celestial realm. It's a level of symbolic precision that you have to appreciate, even if your own departure plans are somewhat less elaborate. Most of us are doing well if we remember to update our passwords before we go. The Abydos boats also give us an unusually intimate window into the relationship between early Egyptian rulers and the people who served them. Building and burying 14 ships is a collective act. It requires not just skilled labour but organised labour, coordinated over months or years. Someone had to manage this project. Someone had to source the materials, supervise the construction, organise the transport, oversee the burial, and ensure that every detail matched what was ritually required. The existence of this fleet is evidence not just of a king's ambition, but of an entire administrative apparatus capable of executing complex large-scale projects on his behalf. Egypt at this early stage wasn't a loose collection of villages deferring vaguely to a distant ruler. It was already a functioning state with the organisational capacity to pull off genuinely impressive logistical feats, in the desert, in the heat, without spreadsheets, email, or anyone to blame when the deadline slipped. The scale of dedication here is worth sitting with for a moment. These weren't people building boats because they expected recognition, or because they'd be around to see the results of their work. They built them because they believed, genuinely, completely, with the kind of conviction that makes you move 75-foot ships through sand, that their ruler would continue after death, and that what they built would matter to him on the other side. That's a remarkable thing. That's not fear of punishment or obedience to a command. That's faith translated directly into carpentry, and the carpentry held up for 5,000 years, so you have to give them credit for execution. What strikes researchers most powerfully about the Abydos discovery is how it collapses the distance between then and now. 5,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen in that interval. Languages have been born and gone completely extinct. The landmasses look more or less the same, but pretty much everything on top of them has changed beyond recognition. And yet here are these boats, preserved in their sand enclosures, testifying to a group of human beings who cared intensely about what happened after death, who loved their ruler enough, or feared him enough, or both, to spend enormous resources, ensuring his comfort in the next life, and who built things well enough that 5 millennia later we can still see the marks of their tools in the wood. The belief those boats represent, that death is a journey, that the soul continues, that the right preparations can carry you through to whatever comes next, is not uniquely Egyptian. It echoes across human cultures in every corner of the world and every era of history. What's uniquely Egyptian is the scale of the commitment. When they decided the dead king needed boats, they didn't build a model. They didn't carve a symbolic representation. They built the actual boats, full-sized and seaworthy, and they put them 6 miles from the nearest water, because the celestial Nile doesn't care about geography. It doesn't care that you're in a desert. It doesn't care that your ships will never see a river again. It only cares that when the king arrives, he arrives with a fleet worthy of a ruler, and so they built one. The Abydos fleet remains one of the most extraordinary archaeological finds of the modern era, not because of its monetary value or its visual drama, though it has both, but because of what it reveals about the minds that created it. These were people with a complete cosmology, a functioning state, advanced technical skills, and a willingness to commit extraordinary resources to ideas that could never be empirically tested. They were, in other words, entirely human. Gloriously, stubbornly, impressively human, and their boats are still here, waiting in the sand 5,000 years later, ready for a voyage that, depending on who you ask, may still be ahead of them. So we've established that the ancient Egyptians were perfectly comfortable burying entire fleets in the desert for theological reasons. But let's talk about what they did when they weren't busy with elaborate afterlife logistics. Because it turns out when Egypt wasn't preparing its kings for the celestial Nile, it was doing something equally impressive, building one of the most sophisticated border control systems the ancient world had ever seen. And most of it is now sitting at the bottom of a lake. Lake Nasser, the vast artificial reservoir created by the construction of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s, is one of the largest man-made lakes on the planet. It stretches for roughly 340 miles across southern Egypt and northern Sudan, and it is, depending on your perspective, either a triumph of modern engineering or the world's most effective archaeological disaster. Because when the waters rose, they swallowed something extraordinary. 15 massive stone fortresses strung out along a 200-mile stretch of the ancient Egyptian frontier, each one a monument to military ambition, economic strategy, and the kind of large-scale state planning that most modern governments would struggle to pull off, even with the benefit of computers and project management consultants. These weren't small outposts. We're not talking about a watchtower and a couple of guards sharing a thermos of something warm. These were full-scale military installations, some of them covering areas the size of several city blocks, with walls thick enough to park a modern vehicle on top of, surrounded by dry moats, fitted with arrow slits, protected by reinforced gatehouses, and designed to house hundreds of soldiers along with all the supplies, equipment, and administrative infrastructure needed to run a militarized border in the middle of one of the most remote and inhospitable landscapes on Earth. And they were built roughly 3,000 years before anyone in medieval Europe thought to try anything similar. When the knights of the Middle Ages were congratulating themselves on their castle designs, Egypt had already run that experiment, documented the results, and filed the paperwork, thousands of years earlier. The most impressive of these fortresses, and the one that has received the most attention from researchers trying to understand what Egypt was actually doing down here, is the fort at Buhan. Buhan sat on the west bank of the Nile in what is now northern Sudan, and even by the standards of ancient military architecture, it was a genuinely staggering piece of construction. The outer walls stretched for roughly half a mile around the perimeter. The defensive ditches were cut deep into the bedrock. The interior contained barracks, administrative buildings, storage facilities, and workshops. Everything you'd need to sustain a permanent military garrison in a place where reinforcements were weeks away, and the local supply options were, to put it, generously limited. This was not a temporary installation. This was a statement of permanent presence, built to last and built to intimidate. But here's the part that transforms Buhan from an impressive military curiosity into something far more interesting. It wasn't primarily a military installation, or rather, it wasn't only a military installation. The fortresses along this stretch of the Nile frontier were the physical infrastructure of an economic system, specifically the system by which Egypt controlled the flow of gold coming out of Nubia. And in the ancient world, Nubian gold wasn't just valuable, it was the foundation of Egyptian power, Egyptian diplomacy, and Egyptian influence across the entire known world. Nubia, the region stretching south of Egypt's traditional heartland, was one of the richest gold-producing territories in the ancient world. The Egyptians knew this. They had known it for centuries, and their relationship with Nubia was shaped from the very beginning by that knowledge. Gold was what funded the pharaoh's building projects. Gold was what paid for military campaigns and diplomatic marriages, and the elaborate ceremonies that kept the Egyptian state running. Gold was what allowed Egypt to project power across a region stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the edges of sub-Saharan Africa. Without Nubian gold, the Egypt of the great pharaohs simply does not exist in the form we know it. The pyramids get considerably smaller, the temples get considerably fewer, the whole magnificent spectacle of ancient Egyptian civilization gets quietly dialed back to something much more modest. So when the pharaohs decided to build 15 fortresses along the Nubian frontier, they weren't just establishing a military perimeter against potential invasions from the south. They were building a customs and revenue system, a physical apparatus for controlling who moved through this corridor, what goods travelled with them, and, most importantly, how much gold was making its way north toward the royal treasury. Every caravan coming out of the gold-producing regions further south had to pass through this chain of fortresses. Every trader, every diplomat, every traveller moving between Egypt and the lands beyond had to pass through gates controlled by Egyptian soldiers, subject to Egyptian inspection, operating under Egyptian rules. It was, in modern terms, essentially the world's first dedicated border crossing system, complete with the paperwork, the waiting, and the suspicious looks from uniformed officials. Some things, unfortunately, never change. The archaeological evidence recovered from these sites before the waters rose, and the more recent work done by researchers using underwater survey techniques to examine what remains below the surface of Lake Nasser, paints a remarkably detailed picture of how this system functioned. The fortresses weren't positioned randomly along the river. They were placed at specific strategic intervals, each one within signalling distance of the next, so that information could be relayed rapidly along the entire frontier. They were located at natural choke points where the geography of the Nile Valley forced movement through narrow corridors that were easy to control. They were positioned near areas where overland routes converged with river routes, ensuring that there was no practical way to move significant quantities of trade goods through this region without passing under Egyptian oversight. The whole setup was essentially an ancient toll road, a 200-mile toll road staffed by soldiers with spears, which is admittedly a more persuasive enforcement mechanism than a camera mounted on a pole. Inside the fortresses, archaeologists found evidence of the full range of activities you'd expect in a combined military and administrative facility. Weapons and armour, naturally, but also scales and weights for measuring gold and other commodities. Administrative records, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of spreadsheets, documenting what passed through and in what quantities. Storage facilities that held not just military supplies, but trade goods in transit. The physical evidence of an institution that was simultaneously an army base, a customs house, a trading post, and a regional government office. The ancient Egyptians figured out remarkably early that the real money wasn't in conquest. It was in controlling the choke points. Something that modern economists would recognize immediately and most ancient empires learned only after several expensive military mistakes. What makes all of this particularly striking is the timeline. The first of these Nubian fortresses were constructed during the Middle Kingdom period, roughly 4,000 years ago. The pharaohs who ordered their construction were working at a moment when Egypt was reasserting its power after a period of internal fragmentation, and one of the very first priorities of the newly reunified state was to push south and lock down the gold supply chain before they finished the domestic building projects, before they sorted out all the internal politics. They built the forts. Because whoever controlled the gold controlled everything else, and these pharaohs were absolutely not interested in leaving that particular variable unmanaged. The sophistication of the military architecture at sites like Buhan also tells us something important about how Egyptian engineers approached the problem of defense. The design incorporates features that historians had previously assumed were medieval innovations, features that didn't appear in European castle design until more than 2,000 years later. The use of projecting towers that allowed defenders to shoot along the face of the walls, catching attackers in crossfire, deep dry ditches to prevent siege equipment from being brought close, multiple defensive layers so that breaching the outer wall just deposited attackers into another kill zone with another wall in front of them. The deliberate placement of choke points at gateways, where defenders could concentrate fire on anyone trying to force an entrance. All of this was already present at Buhan, fully developed, roughly a millennium before classical Greek and Roman military architects began working through similar problems. Medieval Europe essentially reinvented the Egyptian wheel, which is simultaneously impressive and slightly embarrassing for medieval Europe. The flooding of the Nubian fortresses by Lake Nasser was not entirely unforeseeable. There was significant archaeological work done in the region before the dam was completed, and teams of researchers scrambled to document as much as they could before the waters rose. The famous temples at Abu Simbel were physically relocated, an engineering feat nearly as impressive as building them in the first place, involving cutting the entire complex into enormous blocks and reassembling it on higher ground like the world's most stressful jigsaw puzzle. But the fortresses, being less visually spectacular than colossal seated statues, received considerably less attention. Some were documented, some were partially excavated. Many were simply submerged before anyone got a proper look at them, which is the kind of thing that keeps archaeologists awake at 3 a.m. What lies beneath Lake Nasser today is partially unknown, sites that were surveyed under enormous time pressure with the technology of the 1960s, now sitting under tens of meters of water. Researchers who have used sonar and underwater cameras to examine these sites report that much of the stonework is still intact. The walls of Buhan are still standing below the waterline. The architecture that survived 4,000 years of desert exposure is now sitting in reasonably stable conditions at the bottom of a reservoir. It's not ideal, but it's not nothing either. And as underwater archaeology technology continues to improve, There's every reason to think that the fortresses of the Nubian frontier still have stories to tell, about Egypt's southern border, its gold economy, and the complex relationship between military power and economic control that made the pharaohs among the wealthiest rulers in the ancient world. If the Nubian fortresses represent Egypt at its most pragmatic, empire as logistics problem, power as infrastructure, then what happened at Alexandria represents something entirely different. This is Egypt at its most theatrical. And the centerpiece of that theatre was a building so extraordinary that the ancient world literally ran out of superlatives to describe it, and simply put it on the list of the 7 greatest things human beings had ever constructed. We're talking about the Lighthouse of Alexandria, or rather what's left of it, which is specifically a scattered collection of granite blocks sitting on the floor of the eastern harbour, because the lighthouse made the catastrophically poor decision of being in Alexandria during a series of major earthquakes in the medieval period and got knocked directly into the sea. This is objectively an undignified end for one of the most famous structures in human history. You spend several centuries being universally acknowledged as an architectural masterpiece and a wonder of the ancient world, and then the ground shakes a few times and suddenly you're rubble on a seafloor, waiting for underwater archaeologists to come along with measuring equipment and try to piece together what you used to look like. But this is also where the story gets genuinely interesting, because what those archaeologists found on the harbour floor has allowed researchers to reconstruct the lighthouse in more detail than was ever possible from ancient written descriptions alone. And what they've reconstructed is even more impressive than the historical accounts suggested. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, known in antiquity as the Pharos, after the small island near the harbour entrance where it stood, was built in the early 3rd century BC during the reign of Ptolemy I, the Macedonian general who took control of Egypt, after the death of Alexander the Great and founded the dynasty that would eventually end with Cleopatra. The Ptolemies were, in terms of architectural ambition, completely unhinged in the best possible way, and the lighthouse was an early demonstration of this quality. They wanted to build something that would announce Alexandria to the world, a city founded by Alexander himself as the new centre of the Hellenistic world, a place where Greek culture and Egyptian tradition were supposed to fuse into something new and magnificent. The lighthouse was the announcement. Less a building, more a brand launch. At roughly 330 feet tall, it was almost certainly the tallest human-made structure on the planet at the time of its construction, competing only with the Great Pyramid at Giza for that distinction. To put that in perspective, you're looking at a building roughly as tall as a modern 30-story skyscraper, constructed in the 3rd century BC from stone blocks weighing tens of tons, positioned on an island in an active harbour. The structural engineering required to make that work, to build something that tall and that massive in a coastal environment that delivers constant wind, salt air and periodic storm surge, was extraordinary. The fact that it stood for roughly 1,500 years before earthquakes finally brought it down is a testament to how well it was built. Most modern buildings aren't designed to last 1,500 years. The pharaohs managed it without reinforced concrete, steel or structural analysis software. Just really good stone and really skilled engineers who apparently knew exactly what they were doing. The underwater archaeological work in Alexandria's eastern harbour, which began in earnest in the 1990s, recovered somewhere in the region of 3,000 individual stone blocks and architectural fragments from the seafloor, the scattered remains of the lighthouse and the associated royal quarter that had slipped into the water over centuries of earthquakes and coastal subsidence. The logistics of this work were considerable. You're talking about objects ranging from manageable pieces to granite blocks weighing hundreds of tons, all sitting on the floor of an active harbour in conditions that are, to put it charitably, not ideal for detailed archaeological work. Visibility is limited, the water is not clean, there is ongoing boat traffic directly above you. And the objects you're trying to document and recover are so large and heavy that moving them requires planning that would be challenging even on dry land. It's the kind of field work that makes a comfortable desk job look extremely attractive. Among the most significant finds was a doorframe. This might not sound thrilling. Doorframes rarely generate headlines. But this specific doorframe was carved from a single piece of rose granite, weighed approximately 200 tons, and had formed the main entrance to the lighthouse itself. Finding it intact, measuring its dimensions and understanding its position in the original structure allowed researchers to do something that had never been possible before: accurately reconstruct the entrance level of the Pharos with real physical data rather than educated guesswork. Previous reconstructions had been based on ancient coins depicting the lighthouse schematically, fragments of written description of varying reliability, and a great deal of informed imagination. The doorframe gave researchers actual measurements, real proportions, concrete evidence of how the entrance was designed and how it was scaled relative to the rest of the building. It turned historical speculation into architectural precision. What the reconstructions reveal is a building far more sophisticated in its design than the ancient descriptions fully conveyed. The lighthouse wasn't just tall. It was architecturally complex in ways that reflected an extraordinarily high level of design skill. The structure was built in 3 distinct tiers, each set back slightly from the one below, creating a stepped profile that both reduced the wind load on the upper sections and gave the building its distinctive silhouette. The lowest tier was square in cross-section. The middle tier was octagonal. The top tier was cylindrical, capped with a lantern chamber that housed the fire, or according to some accounts, an early reflector system using polished metal surfaces that produced the light visible to approaching ships. Each transition between tiers was marked by decorative colonnades and architectural detailing that made the lighthouse not just a functional structure, but a genuinely beautiful one. This was a building designed to be looked at as much as looked from. Form and function, perfectly integrated 2,000 years before, that became an interior design slogan. The fire at the top, kept burning continuously for as long as the lighthouse operated, was visible, according to ancient sources, from distances of up to 35 miles at sea. A fire of sufficient size, elevated 330 feet above the water, in an era before widespread artificial lighting when the sea at night was genuinely dark, could absolutely be visible at that range under favourable conditions. For sailors approaching Alexandria in darkness, the Pharos was the difference between making harbour safely and ending the voyage on a reef. It was navigation infrastructure on a scale that the ancient world had never attempted, not just a landmark but an active beacon, maintained by a permanent crew whose entire job was to keep the fire burning. Which sounds like either a profoundly meditative or a profoundly tedious way to spend your working life, depending on your temperament. The lighthouse was never only practical, though. From the moment it was completed, it functioned as something more, as a symbol of Alexandria's ambition and the power of the Ptolemaic kingdom, as an architectural argument that this city was the centre of the civilized world and intended to remain. So, ancient writers who visited Alexandria consistently described the Pharos as one of the defining experiences of the city. Not just a navigational aid, but a spectacle, something you travel to see in its own right. The complex around the lighthouse reportedly included temples, administrative spaces, and accommodation for both the permanent crew and the steady stream of visitors who came simply to gawk at it. Ancient tourism was alive and well, and the Pharos was absolutely on the itinerary. No selfie sticks, unfortunately, but the impulse was identical. The structural ambition of the pharaohs also carried a subtler cultural significance. The Ptolemies were Macedonian Greeks ruling an Egyptian population, and their legitimacy rested partly on their ability to present themselves as successors to the pharaonic tradition, while embodying the best of Greek culture simultaneously. The lighthouse was a Greek-Egyptian project in the deepest sense, conceived by rulers steeped in Hellenistic architectural tradition, built in a city at the intersection of Mediterranean and African cultural worlds, incorporating Egyptian materials, and Egyptian labour while reflecting Greek aesthetic principles. It was, in its way, a physical statement about what Alexandria was supposed to be, a fusion, a synthesis, a place where the best of multiple traditions came together into something new and greater than either alone. That vision didn't survive antiquity intact. The lighthouse outlasted the Ptolemaic dynasty, outlasted the Roman conquest of Egypt, outlasted the transition from classical paganism to Christianity, and endured into the early medieval period before the earthquakes of the 14th century finally brought it down. By the time it fell, much of what it had represented, the cosmopolitan, intellectually ambitious, culturally hybrid world of Ptolemaic Alexandria, had long since been transformed beyond recognition. The great library was gone. The philosophical schools had dispersed. The city designed as the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean world had become something different, something older in some ways and newer in others. What remains, scattered across the harbour floor, is the material residue of that extraordinary moment, stone blocks cut by craftsmen who were trying to build something permanent and spectacular in a city that genuinely believed it was going to be the centre of the world forever. They weren't entirely wrong about the permanence. 2,000 years later, people are still diving to the bottom of Alexandria's harbour to find pieces of what they built, still measuring the door frames, still piecing together the profile of a tower that once guided ships home through the dark. That's a kind of immortality. It's just considerably wetter than originally planned. Now, we've spent a good amount of time with Egypt, its desert fleets, its drowned fortresses, its lighthouse at the bottom of a harbour. But Egypt didn't operate in isolation. The ancient Mediterranean was a connected world, a busy, chaotic, extraordinarily productive network of civilizations trading with each other, competing with each other, copying each other's best ideas, and occasionally sinking each other's ships. And nowhere was that interconnectedness more visible or more commercially enthusiastic than in the maritime world of ancient Greece. So let's talk about a ship. A specific ship lying on the seafloor off the coast of Cyprus that has become one of the most informative underwater discoveries in the history of archaeology, not because of what it looks like, but because of what was inside it when it went down. The ship in question sank sometime in the 4th century BC, roughly 2,400 years ago, in waters off the northern coast of Cyprus, and it went down loaded. We're not talking about a small local cargo. We're talking about more than 10,000 ceramic amphorae, the tall, two-handled clay containers that the ancient Greeks used to transport everything from wine and olive oil to fish sauce and grain across the Mediterranean. 10,000 of them. Stacked in the hold, wedged together, layer upon layer, each one sealed with a clay stopper and containing wine from the island of Chios, one of the most prestigious wine-producing regions in the Greek world, a place whose vintage was, in ancient terms, basically the equivalent of a top-shelf label. You didn't ship Chian wine in bulk unless you were running a serious commercial operation. This wasn't someone bringing home a few bottles for dinner. This was a full-scale wine distribution business, and it ended at the bottom of the sea during what was probably a pretty bad afternoon. The wreck, known to researchers as the Kyrenia II area wreck, or more specifically studied as the Mazotos shipwreck, sits at a depth of around 45 metres, deep enough to be beyond easy reach of casual divers, but accessible to properly equipped research teams. And what makes it particularly significant isn't just the volume of the cargo, extraordinary as that is. It's the state of preservation. The amphorae are still stacked roughly as they were when the ship sank. The arrangement of the cargo gives researchers a direct window into how ancient Greek sailors loaded and secured freight, how weight was distributed in the hull, how different categories of cargo were organised relative to each other. It's essentially a snapshot of ancient commercial shipping practice, frozen in the moment of catastrophe and preserved by the cold, low-oxygen conditions of the deep-sea floor. Which is, when you think about it, a genuinely remarkable silver lining to what was certainly a very bad day for whoever was on board. The technology that has transformed researchers' understanding of this wreck is photogrammetry, a technique that uses thousands of overlapping photographs taken from different angles to construct a precise three-dimensional digital model of a site. In practical terms, this means that a team of divers can systematically photograph every square centimetre of a wreck site, upload those images to a computer, and then generate a digital reconstruction so accurate and detailed that researchers can essentially explore the site virtually, measuring distances, examining specific objects, and analysing the spatial relationships between different elements of the cargo without having to physically return to the seafloor every time they have a new question. It's the difference between having to go back to the archive every time you want to check a fact and having the entire archive loaded on your laptop. The wreck becomes, in effect, permanently accessible in a way that no underwater site can be in practice. What photogrammetry revealed at the Mazotos wreck transformed it from an interesting archaeological site into a genuinely revolutionary source of information about ancient Greek commerce. Researchers could map the exact distribution of amphora types across the site, identifying not just that there was Chian wine on board, but precisely where different batches were stored relative to each other, whether amphorae from different origins were mixed or kept separate, how the loading pattern related to the apparent structure of the hull beneath. They could identify individual amphorae that had broken differently from their neighbours, suggesting they were stored differently or had different contents. They could trace the collapse pattern of the cargo as the ship's hull deteriorated, working backward from the current scatter to reconstruct the original stacking arrangement. All of this from photographs, taken by divers, of a pile of ancient pots at the bottom of the sea. The gap between what the technology allows you to know and what it looks like from the outside is genuinely hard to overstate. The Chian wine that filled those amphorae is itself worth dwelling on for a moment, because it tells us something important about the economic logic of ancient Greek trade. Chios was a relatively small island, but its wine had a reputation that stretched across the entire ancient world. Ancient writers praised it. It appeared at high-status banquets in cities from Athens to Alexandria. It was the kind of product that people specifically asked for by origin, not just wine, but Chian wine, in the same way that people today might specify a particular region or producer. That kind of branded regional identity for agricultural products is something we think of as a modern marketing concept. But the Greeks were doing it 2,400 years ago. They had terroir before the French invented the word for it. Chian wine commanded premium prices precisely because people believed, correctly apparently, that wine from that specific island, grown in that specific soil, was better than what you got elsewhere. And someone was shipping it in industrial quantities to Cyprus, which means there was a market waiting for it, and money to be made meeting that demand. The scale of the operation implied by 10,000 amphorae of premium wine is worth sitting with. Filling 10,000 amphorae with wine means producing 10,000 amphorae worth of wine, which means a very substantial vineyard operation on Chios, the cultivation, harvesting, pressing, fermenting, and sealing of an enormous quantity of product. It means manufacturing 10,000 ceramic containers, each one made by hand in a world without industrial pottery production. It means organising the logistics of getting all of that wine to a port, loading it onto a ship and dispatching it to a buyer in Cyprus who had presumably already agreed to take delivery and had the warehouse space and the commercial network to distribute it further. This is not a cottage industry operation. This is organised commerce, with supply chains and credit arrangements and shipping contracts and all the other infrastructure of serious long-distance trade. And it was happening in the 4th century BC, at a scale that would have been recognisable to a modern logistics company, just with worse weather forecasting and no insurance. The absence of insurance is worth noting, actually, because the loss of this ship and its entire cargo of 10,000 amphorae of premium Chian wine was someone's financial catastrophe. Whoever commissioned this shipment, whether a Chian merchant, a Cypriot importer, or some arrangement in between, lost everything when that vessel went down. There was no claim to file, no Lloyds of London to call, no legal mechanism for recovering the value of the cargo. You just lost it. Everything you had invested in growing the grapes, making the wine, manufacturing the containers, arranging the transport and negotiating the sale, all of it at the bottom of the sea. This is not hypothetical commercial risk. This is real commercial disaster, the kind that could ruin families and end trading partnerships, and leave people scrambling to explain to their business associates why the wine they were counting on never arrived. The wreck at Mizotos isn't just an archaeological site, it's the physical evidence of someone's very bad year, and it wasn't unusual. That's the really significant point. The Mizotos wreck is one of dozens of known ancient shipwrecks in the waters around Cyprus alone, and Cyprus is one region among many in a Mediterranean that was crisscrossed with ancient shipping routes. The seafloor of the Mediterranean is, researchers estimate, littered with thousands of ancient wrecks, the accumulated losses of centuries of intensive maritime commerce, each one representing a ship that set out on a routine commercial voyage and didn't come back. The ancient Greeks were not particularly fazed by this. They understood that maritime trade involved risk, that storms were unpredictable, that navigation without instruments and without accurate charts was an imprecise art that sometimes ended badly. They built the risk into their commercial calculations and kept sailing anyway, because the rewards of successful long-distance trade were substantial enough to justify absorbing the losses. It was, in modern terms, a high-risk, high-reward industry. Though the risk in question was not losing your portfolio, it was losing your ship, your crew, and your entire cargo to a storm that the local weather forecast had given no warning about whatsoever. The Greek trading network that the Mizotos wreck represents was, by the 4th century BC, one of the most extensive and sophisticated commercial systems in the ancient world. Greek merchant ships, the round-hulled, deep-bellied cargo vessels that were the commercial backbone of Mediterranean trade, were operating in waters stretching from the coast of Spain to the shores of the Black Sea, from the North African coast to the ports of southern France and the Adriatic. They carried wine, olive oil, luxury pottery, bronze, silver, grain, timber, dyed textiles, and whatever else had commercial value in the cities they visited. They operated on routes that had been established over generations, connecting specific production centres with specific markets, building up the kind of accumulated knowledge about winds, currents, harbour conditions, and seasonal sailing patterns that made the difference between a profitable voyage and a disaster. This knowledge was passed down through seafaring communities, preserved in the memories of experienced pilots and the conversations of merchants who had made the same routes dozens of times. It was essentially a vast distributed database of practical maritime intelligence, held entirely in human heads, and the kind of hard-won experience that you can't learn from a book because no one had written the books yet. What the photogrammetric study of the Mazotos wreck adds to our understanding of this system is a level of material detail that written sources simply cannot provide. Ancient texts tell us that the Greeks traded wine from Chios and other premium-producing regions. They tell us that Cyprus was an important node in Eastern Mediterranean commerce. They tell us, in general terms, that Greek maritime trade was extensive and economically significant. What they don't tell us, what they were never designed to tell us, is how exactly a merchant ship in the 4th century BC organised a cargo of 10,000 amphorae, how the weight was balanced, how different product lines were separated, what the loading sequence looked like, how the ship was rigged relative to its cargo capacity. That kind of granular operational detail is exactly what archaeology provides, and exactly what is invisible in the literary record. The ship at the bottom of the sea is, in a very real sense, more informative than anything a Greek author ever wrote about maritime commerce, because it's not a description, it's the thing itself. The cargo also tells us something about the wine preferences of whoever was waiting for it in Cyprus. Premium Chian wine in bulk implies a market sophisticated enough to know the difference, wealthy enough to pay the premium, and large enough to absorb 10,000 amphorae worth of product. Cyprus in the 4th century BC was a prosperous island, deeply integrated into Eastern Mediterranean trade networks, with a mixed population of Greek settlers and indigenous inhabitants, and a thriving commercial economy. A shipment of this scale suggests an established import market, regular commercial relationships between Chian producers and Cypriot buyers, and the kind of consumer culture that values quality and origin in its wine. Ancient Cypriot wine enthusiasts, in other words, were not so different from their modern counterparts, except that they were getting their supply from a ship that was about to sink, which is the kind of detail that really puts a damper on the evening. The Mazotos wreck will never be fully excavated. The scale of the site, the depth, the complexity of the cargo, and the practical challenges of underwater archaeological work make a complete excavation essentially impossible with current resources. Instead, researchers continue to work the site incrementally, documenting, sampling, analysing, using the photogrammetric model as a navigational tool that allows them to target specific areas for closer investigation and to track changes in the site's condition over time. The wreck is, in this sense, an ongoing project rather than a finished discovery. There are still questions it hasn't answered, still aspects of the cargo arrangement that aren't fully understood, still details of the ship's construction that lie beneath the amphorae waiting to be examined. The ancient Greek wine merchant at the bottom of the sea still has things to tell us. We just need to keep listening. So we've been following a trail of sunken ships and drowned cities across the ancient Mediterranean. Egyptian pharaohs preparing for their celestial voyage, Greek merchants shipping premium wine to customers who never got to drink it. But now we're entering a different category of underwater discovery altogether. Not a trade wreck, not a flooded city, a battlefield. Specifically, the first ancient naval battlefield whose exact location has ever been confirmed with physical archaeological evidence, lying on the floor of the Mediterranean off the western coast of Sicily, marked by bronze warship rams that have been sitting down there for more than 2,200 years. And the battle they came from didn't just change who won a war, it changed who ran the world. The year is 241 BC. Rome and Carthage have been fighting each other for 23 years in what historians call the First Punic War, an extraordinarily brutal, expensive, and exhausting conflict that neither side had really planned for or fully wanted, but that both sides found themselves unable to end on acceptable terms. These two powers were not natural enemies in any simple geographic sense. Rome was the dominant force in the Italian peninsula, an expanding land empire that had spent centuries building its power through conquest and alliance on dry ground. Carthage was the great maritime and commercial empire of the Western Mediterranean, based in what is now Tunisia, with colonies and trading posts spread across North Africa, Spain, and the islands between them. Their interests collided over Sicily, the large island that sits right between the Italian toe and the African coast, a place that both powers recognized as strategically critical and commercially valuable. And so they fought, for 23 years, which is by any measure a long time to be at war over one island, though people have certainly spent longer arguing over less. By 241 BC, both sides were exhausted. Carthage had taken serious losses and was struggling to supply and reinforce its forces on Sicily. Rome had built and lost multiple fleets to storms and battles, an astonishing naval learning curve for a power that had started the war as essentially a non-entity at sea, and was now running one of the most active naval programs in the Mediterranean. The Roman fleet that assembled off the western tip of Sicily in the early months of 241 BC was a product of this education, rebuilt after previous disasters, commanded by officers who understood from painful experience how naval warfare actually worked, crewed by men who had been doing this long enough to get good at it. The Carthaginian fleet they encountered near the Agadi Islands was in considerably worse shape. It was carrying a heavy load of supplies and reinforcements intended for the Carthaginian forces still fighting on Sicily, which meant it was overloaded, riding low in the water and moving sluggishly. Its crews were not at peak readiness. The ships were weighed down not just with provisions but with the full equipment of a supply convoy making a run under difficult circumstances. They were, in naval terms, sitting ducks, if sitting ducks weighed several hundred tons and were crewed by experienced Carthaginian sailors who were not going to give up without a serious fight. The Romans caught them in bad weather, with the wind in the Roman favour. What followed was less a set-piece battle and more a comprehensive disaster for Carthage. Roman warships, lighter and more manoeuvrable in the conditions, rammed into the Carthaginian fleet with devastating effect. The heavy supply-laden Carthaginian ships couldn't manoeuvre effectively, couldn't form up properly, and couldn't bring their own strength to bear against an enemy that had positioned itself perfectly to exploit every disadvantage. Roughly 50 Carthaginian ships were sunk outright, another 70 were captured, the remainder fled. It was, by the standards of ancient naval warfare, a catastrophic defeat, the kind of result that doesn't just lose a battle but breaks a strategic position entirely. Carthage, after 23 years of fighting and enormous expenditure of blood and treasure, simply could not absorb this loss. Without naval control of the Western Mediterranean, it couldn't supply its forces in Sicily. Without those forces, it couldn't hold the island. Without Sicily, the entire strategic position that had justified fighting the war in the first place was gone. Within months, Carthage was negotiating peace on Roman terms. The First Punic War was over, Rome had won, and the Western Mediterranean would never be the same again. Now here's where the seafloor comes in. For centuries, the Battle of the Agadi Islands was a well-documented historical event, described by ancient writers, cited in countless accounts of Roman expansion, but nobody knew exactly where it had happened. The ancient sources described the location in general terms, pointing to the waters west of Sicily near a group of small islands, but translating that into a precise modern location was essentially impossible. The sea doesn't leave obvious markers. A naval battle fought in open water in 241 BC doesn't leave ruins or foundations that you can survey and map. It leaves whatever sank and whatever got dropped overboard in the chaos of combat, and after 2,200 years at the bottom of the Mediterranean, even that evidence is scattered, corroded, and buried under sediment in ways that make it very hard to find, without knowing exactly where to look. The discovery that changed everything started, as many great archaeological finds do, with something that wasn't supposed to be particularly significant. A fisherman working the waters off the Agadi Islands in the late 20th century hauled up a strange bronze object in his nets, a large, heavy, torpedo-shaped piece of metal with holes along the top and a pointed end. It was, to anyone familiar with ancient naval technology, instantly recognizable as a Corvus-class ram, the bronze fitting that was mounted on the prow of an ancient warship just below the waterline, designed to punch through the hull of an enemy. Vessel at ramming speed? Naval rams from the ancient world are not exactly common finds. When you pull one up from waters known to have been the scene of a major ancient battle, it is, to put it in scientific terminology, extremely interesting. What followed was a systematic underwater survey of the seafloor in the area where the fishermen had been working, and the survey found more rams, then more still. By the time researchers had thoroughly worked the site, they had recovered 11 bronze rams, a collection from a single location that represents the largest assemblage of ancient naval rams ever found anywhere in the world. The rams came from both Roman and Carthaginian ships, identifiable partly by their design and partly by the inscriptions cast into some of them, which in several cases recorded the names of Carthaginian officials or Roman magistrates responsible for overseeing the construction of the ships they came from. These weren't anonymous objects. They were dated, attributed, and precisely the kind of physical evidence that allows researchers to say with confidence, this is where the battle happened, right here, on this piece of sea floor. This is not a reconstruction or an estimate. This is the battlefield. The inscriptions on the rams are themselves a remarkable source of information. Several of the Carthaginian rams carry text in Punic, the Semitic language of Carthage, identifying the ships they came from and sometimes the officials who commissioned them. A small number of the Roman rams carry Latin inscriptions with similar information. Taken together, these texts give researchers a direct line into the administrative and military bureaucracy of both powers at the moment of the battle. The names of the men who ordered ships built, the titles of the officials who certified them, the language of the bureaucratic systems that kept these war machines operational. It's not quite reading the battle dispatches of the commanders, but it's the next best thing. Better, in some ways, because it's not filtered through a later historian's agenda or a narrator's desire to tell a good story. It's just the record, cast in bronze, sitting on the seafloor for 2,000 years. Among the other objects recovered from the site was a single amphora, just one. And in the context of this particular discovery, that single amphora is a beautiful piece of evidentiary economy. Analysis of the amphora's clay composition and shape identified it as Carthaginian in origin, consistent with the supplies that the Carthaginian fleet was carrying when the Romans attacked. Its presence at the site, mixed in with the naval rams, provided independent confirmation that the objects found here were genuinely connected to a single event, rather than being scattered debris from various different incidents over the centuries. The amphora and the rams belong to the same story. They ended up in the same place because they went down together, on the same day, in the same battle, 2,241 years ago. One broken clay pot, confirming one of the most consequential naval engagements in ancient history. Not bad for what is essentially just smashed pottery. The significance of the Battle of the Agadi Islands is difficult to overstate if you want to understand how the modern Western world came to look the way it does. Rome before 241 BC was a formidable Italian power, dominant on the peninsula, capable of projecting military force into adjacent regions, but fundamentally a land empire, limited in reach by its dependence on armies that could only go where there was ground to walk on. The victory at the Agadi Islands transformed that. Control of Sicily gave Rome its first significant overseas territory. The treaty terms imposed on Carthage included substantial reparations that helped fund further Roman expansion. More importantly, the war had forced Rome to become a naval power, and having become one, it did not stop. The organizational capacity, the shipbuilding infrastructure, the accumulated expertise of 23 years of maritime warfare, all of that became the foundation for Rome's subsequent expansion across the Mediterranean. Spain, North Africa, Greece, Asia Minor, Egypt. The entire trajectory of Roman imperial expansion follows directly from the moment those bronze rams punched through Carthaginian hulls off the Agadi Islands. Carthage, for its part, was not finished. It would fight Rome twice more in the Punic Wars, coming extraordinarily close to destroying the Roman state in the Second Punic War, when the general Hannibal Barca crossed the Alps with elephants and spent 15 years winning battles in Italy while Rome refused to collapse. But the defeat at Agadi in 241 BC had permanently shifted the balance. Carthage would never again hold the maritime advantage it had once used to build its empire. The sea, after 241 BC, was increasingly Roman. And Rome, as a Mediterranean power rather than just an Italian one, would eventually become Rome as we know it. The empire that built the roads, the laws, the administrative systems, and the cultural frameworks that shaped European civilization for the next 2,000 years. All of that traced back to a stormy morning off the Sicilian coast, 11 bronze rams and 1 broken amphora on a seafloor. The discovery of the Agadi battlefield has also opened up a broader conversation among maritime archaeologists about how many other ancient naval battlefields might be lying undiscovered on Mediterranean sea floors, waiting for the right combination of technology, resources, and slightly lucky fishing nets. Ancient sources describe dozens of major naval engagements in the Mediterranean: the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian conflicts, the wars of Alexander's successors, the subsequent Roman campaigns. Most of these battles have never been located with any precision. The Agadi discovery demonstrated that such locations can be found, and that when found, they yield exactly the kind of direct physical evidence that transforms historical reconstruction from educated guesswork into documented fact. The seafloor of the Mediterranean is, in a very real sense, the largest unexcavated archive of ancient history on the planet. The Agadi Islands showed us just one page of it. The rest is still down there, waiting. We just watched Rome transform itself into a Mediterranean superpower off the coast of Sicily. But winning battles and running an empire are two very different problems, and the second one is considerably less glamorous than the first. Conquering the Mediterranean is exciting. Feeding 1 million people every single day for several centuries is a logistics nightmare. And the Romans, being the Romans, solved that nightmare by building something so enormous, so meticulously engineered, and so absolutely essential to the functioning of their civilization that without it the entire imperial project simply collapses. We're talking about Portus, the greatest artificial harbour complex the ancient world ever produced, now hidden under fields and farmland about 15 miles from the centre of Rome, barely visible at the surface, almost entirely unappreciated by the millions of tourists who drive past it every year on their way to see the Colosseum. Let's start with the basic problem. Rome at its peak had somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million residents crammed into a city that could not remotely feed itself from its surrounding territory. The agricultural land within practical reach of the city was nowhere near sufficient to supply that population. Grain had to come from outside, from Sicily, from North Africa, from Egypt, from the grain-producing provinces of the empire. In practical terms, this meant a continuous flow of cargo ships crossing the Mediterranean, sailing up the Italian coast, and somehow getting their contents to the city. The Tiber River, Rome's connection to the sea, was technically navigable, but barely. The river mouth at Ostia was shallow, silted, and treacherous for large vessels. The river itself was too narrow and too twisting for efficient commercial traffic at the scale the city required. Rome's location, which had been a military and political asset during the centuries of Italian conquest, was a genuine logistical liability once the empire needed to import food for 1 million people. Geography, it turns out, does not update itself to accommodate your ambitions. The Emperor Augustus recognized this problem and began work on a solution. His successor Claudius took that solution and built it on a truly spectacular scale. And then Trajan came along, looked at what Claudius had built and said, accurately as it turned out, that it still wasn't quite enough. The result of this 3-generation engineering project was Portus, a harbour complex covering hundreds of acres, capable of handling the entire commercial throughput of the Roman world's largest city, connected to the Tiber by a purpose-built canal, and organised with the kind of systematic efficiency that the Romans applied to everything from road building to legal codes. It was, in the language of modern logistics, a fully integrated supply chain hub. In the language of people who are appropriately impressed by ancient engineering, it was absolutely extraordinary. The centrepiece of the complex, and the feature that makes the whole thing visually and conceptually indelible, is the hexagonal basin that Trajan added in the early 2nd century AD. Imagine a perfectly regular 6-sided geometric pool, each side roughly 400 metres long, cut from the landscape with the kind of precision that required both sophisticated surveying technology and an absolutely enormous amount of excavation. The hexagonal shape was not a stylistic choice. The hexagon distributes structural stress efficiently and allows maximum berthing space per unit of perimeter. The Romans picked it because it was the optimal geometry for the problem they were solving, which is either impressive engineering logic, or the ancient equivalent of someone sending a very long email to explain why they chose a particular font. Either way, it worked. The basin could accommodate more than 100 large cargo vessels simultaneously, not queuing outside, not waiting at anchor in the roadstead. Moored directly alongside the quays, loading and unloading their cargoes in parallel, cycling through the harbour with the kind of throughput that kept Rome's food supply running continuously. It was the ancient equivalent of a container port, operating at that scale 1,900 years ago. The logistics of what Portus handled are, when you run the numbers, genuinely staggering. Rome consumed enormous quantities of grain every year. Historians estimate somewhere between 250,000 and 400,000 tons annually just for basic food requirements, before you add wine, olive oil, building materials, luxury goods, military supplies, and everything else that a city of 1 million people needs to function. Getting that volume of material into the city required a constant flow of ships arriving, unloading and departing, on good days and bad days, in summer sailing season and in the narrower winter windows, year after year without interruption. A breakdown in that supply chain didn't mean higher prices or temporary inconvenience. It meant riots. It meant political instability. It potentially meant the kind of urban crisis that could topple governments and end careers spectacularly. Roman emperors understood this with the bone-deep clarity of people who had seen what happened when the grain ran short. Keep the city fed and distracted, or face the consequences. Not much has changed, honestly. The delivery timescales are shorter now, but the panic when the supply chain breaks is essentially identical. Connecting Portus to Rome was a system of waterways that combined natural geography with purpose-built canals in a way that maximized efficiency while minimizing the limitations of each individual element. The Fossa Traiana, Trajan's canal, ran from the hexagonal basin directly to the Tiber, bypassing the difficult river mouth at Ostia and giving cargo vessels a controlled, predictable route into the river system. From there, smaller riverboats, flat-bottomed, shallow-draft craft designed specifically for river transport, took the cargo upstream to Rome, where the river docks received it and distributed it into the city's warehouses and markets. The whole system was a relay: ocean-going cargo ships to the hexagonal basin, canal vessels to the Tiber, river barges to the city. Each component was optimized for its specific function. None of it was improvised. All of it was planned, built, and maintained by an imperial administration that understood supply chain management well enough to run it at continental scale, for several centuries, without a single spreadsheet. The warehouses at Portus, Horea in Latin, were another component that modern researchers have only recently begun to fully appreciate. The complex contained enormous storage facilities where grain, oil, wine, and other goods could be held while awaiting onward shipment. These weren't simple sheds. They were sophisticated structures with thick walls, raised floors to allow air circulation beneath the stored goods, specific orientation to manage temperature and humidity, and organizational systems that tracked what was stored where and in what. Quantities. The Romans understood that storage is not passive. If you want goods to arrive at their destination in usable condition, you have to actively manage how they're stored. The Horea of Portus were, in modern terms, climate-managed distribution centres, which is admittedly an anticlimactic description for a Roman warehouse, but there's no more honest way to put it. The most direct physical evidence of what actually moved through Portus came from a remarkable series of underwater and waterlogged discoveries in the harbour's silted-up basins and canals. Over the course of archaeological work at the site, researchers recovered the remains of multiple ancient vessels, some of the best-preserved Roman merchant ships ever found anywhere. These weren't warships. They were the unglamorous workhorses of Roman commercial life, broad-beamed, deep-hulled cargo carriers designed to maximize carrying capacity at the expense of speed and elegance. They were not fast. They were not beautiful. They were functional, and they were built to a standard that reflects a mature shipbuilding tradition, with centuries of accumulated knowledge about what worked and what didn't in the conditions they operated in. Examining their construction gave researchers direct access to Roman commercial shipbuilding practice: how planks were joined, how hulls were waterproofed, how internal structure was organized to handle the stresses of a heavy cargo load at sea. Information that exists nowhere in any Roman text, but that was sitting in the silted mud of an ancient harbour waiting to be found. One detail that strikes researchers examining these vessels is the evidence of repair and reuse. Roman merchant ships weren't replaced the moment they showed wear. They were patched, rebuilt, refitted, and sent back out again, sometimes to the point where substantial portions of the original hull had been replaced and renewed over the course of a working life. This tells us something important about the economics of Roman maritime trade. Vessels represented a major capital investment, and their owners squeezed every possible year of service from them before retirement. It also tells us about the level of skilled ship repair work available at Portus, the craftsmen, the material stockpiles, the technical knowledge needed to keep a working commercial fleet operational. There is something deeply relatable about a Roman shipowner patching a hull for the fourth time rather than replacing it, doing the calculations and deciding it was still cheaper than buying new. Some financial logic is timeless. The human scale of Portus is easy to lose in the engineering statistics, but it's worth thinking about. At peak operation, this complex employed thousands of workers, dockers unloading cargo, crane operators working the mechanical lifting equipment at the quays, warehouse managers tracking inventory, canal boat crews, customs officials, engineers. Maintaining the infrastructure, craftsmen repairing ships and handling equipment. There were taverns, workshops, shrines, and accommodation. There was eventually a bishop's palace, suggesting that Portus grew large enough to have its own ecclesiastical administration, which is ancient Rome's way of saying it had officially become a proper city in its own right rather than just a harbour. Inscriptions found at the site record the names and occupations of workers who spent their lives in the complex, men who identified themselves professionally as grain measurers, warehouse supervisors, ship pilots, cargo assessors. These weren't anonymous labourers. They were professionals in an established industry, with career identities tied to specific work in a specific place. Portus gave them not just employment, but occupational purpose. The fall of Portus is, in its way, as instructive as its construction. As Roman imperial power weakened in the 4th and 5th centuries, the complex's maintenance became increasingly difficult to sustain. The canals silted up. The harbour basins filled with sediment. The infrastructure that had required constant investment and administrative attention began to deteriorate faster than a weakened administration could repair it. Portus didn't collapse suddenly, it faded gradually as supply chains contracted, as Rome's population declined from its imperial peak, as the economic geography of the Mediterranean shifted. By the medieval period, the harbour that had once managed the food supply of 1 million people had become farmland, its basins invisible beneath centuries of accumulated earth, its extraordinary engineering achievement buried and forgotten under fields that showed no hint of what lay beneath. What modern archaeology has uncovered at Portus, using aerial photography to reveal structural outlines beneath the fields, ground-penetrating radar to map what lies below the surface, and careful excavation of specific areas to recover material. Evidence is the physical record of something genuinely remarkable. The infrastructure that kept one of history's great cities alive for centuries. Rome is famous for its architecture, its military victories, its legal innovations, its cultural output. Portus was the foundation that made all of that possible. The Colosseum is a triumph of entertainment engineering. The hexagonal basin of Trajan was a triumph of supply chain management. The Pantheon is a triumph of architectural beauty. The grain warehouses of Portus were a triumph of practical necessity. Neither could exist without the other. And the one that nobody visits is the one without which the other wouldn't have been possible. That's not a criticism of the tourists. That's just how infrastructure works. It only becomes visible when it stops working, and Portus worked spectacularly for longer than most modern nations have existed. We've just spent time at Portus, the colossal harbour complex that kept Rome fed and functioning, the responsible, practical, bureaucratic side of Roman imperial power. Now let's talk about the irresponsible, extravagant, spectacularly unhinged side. Because Rome wasn't just grain shipments and hexagonal basins, Rome was also Nero. And Nero, in the summer of 64 AD, had just watched a significant portion of the city burn to the ground, and immediately saw in that catastrophe not a human tragedy to be managed, but a real estate opportunity to be seized. The story of what followed is one of the most outrageous in Roman history, and there's a ship at the bottom of the sea off the Spanish coast that connects directly to it. The Bufera wreck was discovered by accident, the way so many great underwater finds are, by divers who weren't specifically looking for it, in waters that had been crossed thousands of times without anyone suspecting what lay below. It sits at a depth of around 70 metres off the coast near what is now Villajoyosa in southeastern Spain, and when researchers began systematically examining and excavating it, they found a cargo that was, on the surface, fairly routine by Roman maritime standards. The hold was packed with amphorae containing garum, the fermented fish sauce that the Romans used the way a significant portion of the modern world uses soy sauce or Worcestershire sauce, which is to say, on absolutely everything, in quantities that would alarm a modern nutritionist. Garum was the universal condiment of the Roman world, the flavour backbone of Roman cooking, produced in industrial quantities at facilities along the Spanish and North African coastlines, and shipped throughout the empire in the familiar two-handled ceramic containers that keep turning up on Mediterranean seafloors. A ship full of garum was, in the context of Roman commerce, about as extraordinary as a truck full of ketchup. Useful, certainly. Historically interesting in aggregate. Not by itself, the kind of thing that gets archaeologists particularly excited. But packed in among the amphorae, researchers found something else entirely. 22 lead ingots, each one substantial in size and weight, and each one stamped with markings that identified them as imperial property, the product of state-controlled mining operations in the Spanish provinces, bearing the administrative stamps of the Roman imperial bureaucracy. Lead ingots from Roman-era contexts are not uncommon finds. The Romans used lead for everything from water pipes to cooking vessels to the weights that held down fishing nets, and they produced it at an industrial scale from mines across the empire. But 22 ingots with imperial markings, on a ship that could be dated to a specific and very consequential period of Roman history, is a different matter altogether. Because coins found in the wreck dated the ship's sinking to the reign of Nero, specifically to the period in the mid-60s AD, just after one of the most famous and catastrophic events in all of Roman history. The Great Fire of Rome. The fire broke out in the summer of 64 AD, starting in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus, and spreading with terrifying speed through a city that was, by any modern assessment, a fire waiting to happen. Rome was densely packed with wooden structures, multi-story residential buildings crammed together along narrow streets, workshops full of flammable materials, and the kind of urban density that turns a small fire into an inferno within hours. The blaze burned for 6 days, paused briefly, then reignited and burned for another 3. When it was finally over, roughly 2/3 of the city had been destroyed or severely damaged. Hundreds of thousands of people had lost their homes. Ancient temples, public buildings, and entire neighbourhoods that had stood for centuries were gone. Nero's response to this disaster was, depending on your source, either admirably practical or breathtakingly self-serving, or, most likely, in both simultaneously. On the practical side, he organised relief efforts, opened public buildings to shelter the homeless, and arrange for emergency food supplies to prevent starvation in the displaced population. On the considerably less admirable side, he then proceeded to claim a substantial portion of the fire-cleared land in the centre of Rome for a personal building project of such staggering ambition and expense that it shocked even a Roman public that was accustomed to imperial extravagance. The project was the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and it was, by any objective measure, absolutely unhinged. The Domus Aurea was not a palace in the conventional sense. It was an entire landscaped complex covering somewhere between 100 and 300 acres of prime central Roman real estate. The ancient sources disagree on the exact extent, possibly because the scale was difficult to process even for people who lived in the same city. It included a colonnaded entrance facade reportedly stretching a mile in length. It included gardens, vineyards, forests, and an artificial lake large enough to be described by contemporaries as resembling a sea. It included dining rooms with rotating ceilings designed to shower guests with flowers or spray them with perfume. It included walls and ceilings covered in gold leaf, hence the name, as well as semi-precious stones, ivory inlays, and painted decorations of extraordinary quality and cost. Nero reportedly said, upon first viewing the completed complex, that he could finally begin to live like a human being, which tells you everything you need to know about what Nero considered basic standards of comfort, and also explains why his reign ended the way it did. Building something of this scale required materials, enormous quantities of materials, and among the most critical was lead, for the water supply infrastructure that the complex required, for the elaborate plumbing systems that served its baths and fountains, for the structural elements that underpinned its construction. Lead was an essential Roman building material, and a project of the Domus Aurea's scale would have consumed it in vast quantities. Imperial lead, mined in the Spanish provinces and stamped with the administrative marks of the state, transported by sea to Italy. This is exactly what the ingots on the Boufferet represent. A specific shipment, from specific mines, in transit to serve a specific and spectacularly ambitious building project that met its end somewhere in the waters off the Spanish coast and spent the next 2,000 years sitting on the seafloor. The connection is not proven with absolute certainty. Archaeology rarely offers that level of documentary precision. But the timing is right, the markings are right, the route is right. A ship carrying imperial lead from Spanish mines, sinking in waters on the route between Spain and Italy, in the period when Rome was rebuilding after its greatest urban disaster, and Nero was simultaneously constructing the most extravagant private residence in the history of the city. The circumstantial evidence is compelling enough that researchers take the connection seriously. The Boufferet wreck is, in effect, a frozen moment in one of the most dramatic episodes of the early imperial period. A routine commercial voyage carrying the raw material of imperial ambition, ended by a storm or a navigational mishap, the cargo. Sinking to the seafloor while the project it was meant to serve continued above ground in Rome with or without this particular consignment. Nero himself, of course, didn't get to enjoy the Domus Aurea for long. The political backlash from building a personal pleasure complex on the ruins of a city that had just burned to the ground, while simultaneously persecuting Christians as convenient scapegoats for the fire, managing a significant military revolt into the provinces, and antagonizing essentially every powerful interest group in Rome simultaneously, proved insurmountable. In 68 AD, 4 years after the Great Fire, Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate and committed suicide, reportedly lamenting that the world was losing a great artist. He was 30 years old. Upon his death, the Domus Aurea was systematically stripped, filled in, and built over by his successors, who were understandably eager to erase the most conspicuous monument to Neronian excess from the Roman landscape. The Colosseum was later built on the site of the artificial lake, which is a genuinely satisfying piece of urban symbolism, replacing the private pleasure of one man with a public entertainment venue for the entire city. What the Boufferet wreck adds to this story is a material dimension that no ancient text can provide. The ancient sources that describe Nero and the Great Fire and the Domus Aurea are literary products, shaped by the agendas of their authors, filtered through the values and assumptions of Roman upper-class culture, edited and interpreted by every copyist and translator who handled them over the centuries. They tell us stories. They give us Nero's reported quotations and his architectural ambitions and the public reaction to his behaviour, but they don't give us the supply chains. They don't give us the lead shipments and the cargo manifests and the commercial machinery that turned Nero's fantasies into physical reality. The ship does. The ingots do. The cargo of garum packed around them does, because a ship carrying both fish sauce and imperial building materials is not a contradiction. It's just commerce. Traders didn't make ideological distinctions about what they carried. If the cargo paid, you carried it. The Boufferet was a working vessel in an empire-wide commercial network, and it was in that network's nature to serve everyone from small-time provincial traders to the most powerful ruler in the Western world. The wreck also reminds us that the Roman Empire was not just a political or military phenomenon. It was an economic system of extraordinary reach and complexity, one in which the emperor's building projects and the fish sauce trade and the Spanish mining operations and the Mediterranean shipping routes were all components of a single integrated mechanism. Pull on any one thread and you find it connected to all the others. Nero wanted a gold palace. That meant lead from Spain. That meant ships crossing the Mediterranean. That meant, on at least one occasion, a ship that didn't make it, carrying cargo that ended up on the seafloor instead of in the walls of a building that itself got torn down within a decade. History is full of this kind of irony. The lead never reached Rome. The palace it was meant to serve was demolished by Nero's successors. And yet here are the ingots, perfectly preserved at the bottom of the sea 2,000 years later, more durable than the empire that produced them, more lasting than the ambitions they were meant to serve, and infinitely more informative than Nero. Deserve to be? We've talked about Nero wanting a gold palace and the lead ingots that were supposed to help build it. But Nero, for all his extravagance, was not an isolated case. The Roman ruling class had, over the course of several centuries, developed a remarkably consistent tradition of spectacular, guilt-free excess, and they had a favourite destination for it. A specific place on the Italian coast where the usual rules of Roman social propriety were understood by everyone to be temporarily suspended. A resort town where senators, emperors, poets, and anyone else wealthy enough to afford it went to drink, bathe, scheme, seduce, and generally conduct themselves in ways they wouldn't have dared back in Rome. That place was Baiae. And today, 430 acres of its streets, villas, temples and bathhouses are sitting at the bottom of the Bay of Naples, which is either a fitting geological punishment for a city of that reputation or an enormous loss for underwater archaeology, depending on how you look at it. Baiae sat on a promontory on the northern edge of the Bay of Naples, in a landscape that was geologically extraordinary, even by the standards of a peninsula built largely on volcanic foundations. The entire region sits within a vast volcanic system called the Campi Flegrei, the Phlegraean Fields, a caldera complex that has been geologically active for hundreds of thousands of years and remains active today. The ground here is warm. In places, steam vents rise directly from the earth. Natural hot springs bubble up along the coastline, warm enough to heat the bay water to temperatures that would have seemed miraculous to anyone who hadn't grown up there. For the Romans, who had developed an elaborate bathing culture and a deep appreciation for thermal waters as both medical treatment and social occasion, Baiae was essentially paradise. Warm mineral springs on a beautiful coastline, close enough to Rome for a comfortable journey, far enough away to feel like a proper escape. It had everything, and the Romans were not shy about using it. The reputation of Baiae in Roman literature is consistent and colourful. Ancient writers describe it in terms that oscillate between admiring and scandalised, often simultaneously. It was a place where marriages dissolved and affairs began, where philosophical restraint went on extended holiday and apparently forgot to come back, where the normal expectation of dignified public behaviour that Roman upper-class culture imposed on its members was quietly understood to not apply. Cicero had a villa there and complained about his neighbours' parties, which is both extremely relatable and slightly ironic given Cicero's own reputation for enjoying himself. Julius Caesar had a villa there. Augustus had a villa there. Nero, because of course Nero had a villa there, reportedly murdered his own mother nearby, which even by Baiae's generous moral standards was considered excessive. The poet Propertius described it as a sewer of luxury, which was clearly intended as criticism, but reads today as more of a 5-star travel recommendation. If ancient Yelp had existed, Baiae's reviews would have been spectacular, confusing, and occasionally alarming in ways that raise more questions than they answer. The physical city that produced this reputation was substantial. Baiae wasn't a small seaside village with a few wealthy residents escaping the city. It was a major resort complex, villas cascading down the hillsides toward the water, large public bathing complexes fed by the thermal springs, temples, markets, warehouses, and all the supporting infrastructure of a place that hosted a significant and demanding year-round population. The wealthy built elaborate waterfront properties that extended out over the bay itself, constructing artificial platforms and terraces that pushed the usable land area of the resort further and further into the water. This was, it turned out, a structural decision that the geology of the region had a very strong opinion about. The process that sank Baiae is called bradycism, and it is one of the more dramatic geological phenomena that people have ever decided to build a major city directly on top of. The Campi Flegrei caldera is not a dead volcanic system. It is an active one, and its activity expresses itself through the movement of the ground surface as magma and hydrothermal fluids move in and out of the chambers beneath. When magma or hot fluids accumulate in the subsurface chambers, the ground above rises. When those fluids withdraw or cool, the ground subsides again. This up and down movement has been occurring in the Campi Flegrei for millennia, and Baiae was built directly within the zone of maximum displacement. The city didn't fall into the sea because of a single catastrophic event. It sank gradually over centuries, the ground dropping steadily beneath it, until the lower districts were underwater, and the waterfront villas were flooded, and the bathhouses that had been built at sea level were now well below it. The sea didn't come to Baiae. Baiae went to the sea. Slowly, incrementally, and without asking anyone's permission. The current state of the submerged city is, from an archaeological perspective, remarkable. The streets are intact beneath the water. The mosaic floors of the villas are still in place. Statues that once decorated the public spaces and private gardens are still standing in their original positions, or lying where they fell when the structures around them eventually collapsed. The thermal bathing complexes, with their elaborate systems of pipes, chambers, and heated rooms, are still identifiable in the underwater landscape. Baiae didn't get systematically looted before it sank. It went down gradually enough that people had time to leave and take their portable valuables, but the fixed elements of the city's architecture remained in place. What divers encounter in the waters off the modern town of Baiae is a Roman resort paused in time, not perfectly preserved, not undamaged, but recognisably itself, still organised along the street patterns and property lines of the 1st century AD. It is among the most intact Roman cities you can visit. You just need to bring scuba gear. The archaeological work done at Baiae has produced extraordinary images and extraordinary finds. Mosaic floors photographed in situ beneath several metres of seawater. Marble sculpture recovered from positions indicating it was still standing when the water rose around it. Fragments of painted wall plaster still bearing traces of colour after 2,000 years of submersion. The scale of wealth invested in this city, the quality of the materials, the sophistication of the decorative programs, the engineering ambition of the buildings, is visible in every object that comes out of the water. Baiae was not a modest resort for moderately comfortable people. It was where the Roman world's most powerful and most extravagant individuals came to spend money in competitive quantities. The archaeology reflects that with slightly depressing clarity. Even the ruins are ostentatious. The volcanic system responsible for sinking Baiae has not finished its work. The Campi Flegrei caldera is currently in a period of renewed activity. The ground across a substantial area around the modern city of Pozzuoli has been rising measurably over recent decades. Earthquake swarms have become more frequent. The scientific community monitors the system closely and maintains emergency response plans for scenarios that include volcanic events capable of threatening the millions of people living in Naples and the surrounding area. Those millions of people are technically living inside one of Europe's most active volcanic systems. This is well understood. It is also clearly not sufficient reason to move, which tells you everything you need to know about how much Italians love their coastline. You can't entirely blame them. The view is spectacular, and the thermal springs are still warm. From Roman excess on a slowly sinking Italian coastline, we travel north, very far north, to a frozen Norwegian field where a discovery was made that reframes everything most people think they know about Vikings. The popular image is a straightforward one. Large, bearded, heavily armed, arriving on your coastline without an appointment and leaving with your valuables. Not exactly the portrait of a sophisticated maritime civilization. But the ships those Vikings sailed, and the buried vessel found beneath Norwegian farmland, and the sunken trading ship recovered from coastal waters, tell a considerably more complex and considerably more impressive story that has a lot less to do with axes and a lot more to do with engineering. The burial ship was found using ground-penetrating radar beneath a low mound in a Norwegian agricultural field, the kind of landscape feature that might look like a natural rise to an untrained eye, but that anyone familiar with Scandinavian burial traditions would recognise immediately as a potential gravesite. The radar survey revealed a ship-shaped shadow beneath the surface, a vessel approximately 65 feet in length, buried as part of a high-status funerary ritual. This was not a small boat. 65 feet is a serious vessel, large enough to carry a substantial crew across open water, large enough to represent a major investment of timber, labour and technical expertise. And someone had put it in the ground as a burial offering, which tells you immediately that whoever was buried with it was not an ordinary member of Viking society. Ordinary people in Viking Age Scandinavia did not get buried with ships. Ordinary people got a patch of ground and a stone marker if they were lucky. Ships were reserved for the exceptional. Ship burials of this scale are extraordinarily rare. In all of Norway, only 4 comparable vessels have ever been found, the most famous being the Osberg and Gokstad ships, now displayed in Oslo and recognised globally as among the finest examples of Viking Age craftsmanship. Each new discovery joins a list so short you can count it on one hand. The vessel found beneath that Norwegian field is therefore not a local curiosity. It's a significant addition to a category of evidence that archaeology almost never gets access to, and every new example provides information that no other source can supply. What makes Viking ships so significant, and what the physical evidence of buried and sunken vessels makes tangible in a way no written description fully conveys, is the engineering. The design represents a solution to ocean sailing that was genuinely different from what other maritime cultures were doing, and that difference is precisely what gave the Vikings their extraordinary range. The construction method is called clinker building. The planks of the hull overlap each other like the scales of a fish, each fixed to its neighbour with iron rivets along the overlapping edge. This sounds simple, but the structural implications are profound. A clinker-built hull is flexible. In heavy seas, the overlapping planks can move slightly relative to each other. The hull flexes rather than remaining rigid. To a structural engineer trained on the principle that structures should be as stiff as possible, this sounds alarming. In practice, it's brilliant. Flexibility distributes stress across the entire hull rather than concentrating it at specific joints, meaning the vessel can absorb the punishment of North Atlantic conditions without the failures that would destroy a more rigid construction. Viking ships could survive seas that would have wrecked other vessels of their era, not because of better materials, but because the design philosophy was fundamentally better suited to what the North Atlantic actually required. Nature doesn't care about your design assumptions. The Vikings learned that and adjusted accordingly. The hull shape was the other critical element. Viking ships were built with a shallow draft, the hull extended only a small distance below the waterline, and a symmetrical profile equally pointed at both bow and stern. This combination had two consequences that transformed the possibilities of Viking activity entirely. Shallow draft meant these ships could navigate in water that would have grounded any other ocean-going vessel of the period. Not just open sea, but rivers, estuaries, tidal flats, and coastal shallows. A Viking fleet could cross the North Atlantic and then sail directly up a European river to strike settlements far inland. The same vessel that had crossed open ocean threading through water, barely deep enough to float in. The people living along those rivers had not designed their defences around the possibility of an ocean-going warship appearing in their backyard, because nobody had thought it was possible. The Vikings had effectively combined a transoceanic ship with a riverboat. It was, in military terms, a comprehensively unfair advantage, and they used it enthusiastically. The symmetrical bow and stern profile meant reversing course required no elaborate manoeuvring. In tight coastal waters, in narrow river channels, in the confined approaches to a harbour, a Viking ship could simply reverse direction without turning around. In waters where turning radius was a limiting factor, this mattered enormously, and it also made beaching and launching faster. Both ends of the ship behaved identically when meeting a shoreline, streamlining the rapid deployment and retrieval that Viking raiding tactics required. Show up fast, load up, leave faster. The ship made it possible. The trading vessel found off southern Norway adds a dimension to the Viking story that the popular imagination consistently underweights. It was carrying whetstone cargo, sharpening stones, quarried from specific geological deposits in Scandinavia, and distributed across northern Europe and beyond. Not glamorous. Whetstones are not gold or exotic spices. They are the kind of mundane, essential tool that every farm, every workshop, every household that uses edged implements needs. Which is to say, everyone needs them, and nobody gets excited about them. And that is precisely the point. The Viking trading network was not built on luxury goods alone. It was built on the systematic distribution of useful commodities across a geography stretching from the markets of the Middle East, through the river systems of Russia, across northern Europe, and ultimately to the shores of North America. The yield first sustained European contact with the Western Hemisphere, achieved not by accident, but by the incremental extension of a commercial maritime network that was already connecting 3 continents before anyone in southern Europe had seriously considered that a Western Hemisphere might exist. Scandinavian whetstone exports are documented archaeologically across an extraordinary range. Stones from specific Norwegian quarries have been found at sites across Britain, Ireland, France, the Baltic region, and further east, all dating to the Viking Age. This distribution is the physical trace of a commercial network operating at a scale that the word Viking does not typically conjure. These were not raiders who occasionally traded on the side. They were systematic long-distance merchants who happened to also be extremely effective raiders, or extremely effective raiders who happened to also be systematic long-distance merchants, depending entirely on which end of the transaction you were experiencing. The same ships, the same crews, the same maritime skills that enabled a raid on an Irish monastery also enabled a trading voyage to Constantinople or a colonization expedition to Iceland. The ship was the tool. What you did with it depended on the opportunity in front of you. The buried ship and the sunken trader are separated by function, one a statement of belief about what came after death, the other a working vessel conducting the unremarkable business of moving goods from where they were produced to where they were needed. But both are products of the same technological tradition. The clinker hull, the shallow draft, the flexible design that could handle North Atlantic storms and Norwegian coastal shallows with equal competence. That technology didn't emerge by accident. It was developed over generations of Scandinavian boat building, refined through accumulated experience with the specific and unforgiving demands of northern waters, and passed down through a craft tradition that treated shipbuilding as among the highest technical achievements a community could demonstrate. The Vikings weren't dominant at sea because they were unusually violent or unusually brave, though they were certainly not lacking in either department. They were dominant because they had better ships. And the ships in the Norwegian field and on the southern seabed are the proof, sitting right there, waiting for anyone patient enough to look. We've crossed the ancient Mediterranean, watched Rome build and sink and burn, followed Vikings to the edges of the known world. Now we close this journey somewhere entirely different, not in the old world at all, but in the jungles and underwater cave systems of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, where a civilization that was already ancient when Rome was still a collection of mud. Huts built something extraordinary, watched it strain under pressures that would have broken most societies, and then did something that the popular history books get almost entirely wrong about. They didn't collapse, they transformed, and the evidence for exactly what happened and exactly how is sitting at the bottom of a series of flooded limestone sinkholes that the Maya considered the most sacred places on Earth. The cenotes of the Yucatan are one of the more remarkable geological features on the planet. The entire Yucatan Peninsula sits atop a vast shelf of porous limestone, honeycombed with underground cave systems carved out over millions of years by slightly acidic groundwater dissolving the rock from beneath. Where the cave roofs collapse, you get sinkholes, circular or oval openings in the earth leading down to pools of extraordinarily clear, still water connected to the underground network below. The Maya called these openings the mouths of the underworld. In a landscape with no rivers and almost no surface water sources, the cenotes were not just sacred, they were survival. They were the only reliable fresh water available across enormous stretches of the peninsula, and the civilization that grew up around them organized its geography, its agriculture, and its spiritual life in direct relationship to these portals in the Earth. What researchers have found in those portals, over decades of increasingly sophisticated underwater archaeological work, is a record of Maya religious practice that is at once beautiful, disturbing, and illuminating in ways that surface archaeology simply cannot match. The cenotes were not just water sources, they were temples, without walls or roofs, where the Maya conducted rituals connecting the living world to the underworld below. They threw offerings into the water, ceramic vessels, jade ornaments, obsidian blades, incense burners, carved figurines, rubber balls used in the ceremonial ball game. Objects of enormous symbolic value, surrendered permanently to the dark water beneath, gifts to the gods of the underworld in exchange for rain, fertility, and the continuation of the agricultural cycles that kept the civilization alive. The cenotes received these offerings and kept them, preserved in the cool, oxygen-poor conditions of the underground water system, for centuries and in some cases millennia. Among the most significant finds recovered from Yucatan cenotes are objects that tell a very specific story about what the Maya were doing in the 9th century AD, a period that the popular historical narrative describes, somewhat dramatically, as the Maya collapse, skulls bearing marks of trauma consistent with sacrifice. Stingray spines, used in bloodletting rituals where participants pierced their own flesh as an offering of the most personal kind possible. And most striking of all, a carved stone sculpture of Tlaloc, the Aztec god of rain and water, found in a cenote context that predates the Aztec civilization's political dominance and suggests a level of cultural exchange between the Maya of the Yucatan and the central Mexican highlands that historians are still working to fully understand. The Tlaloc sculpture is worth dwelling on because it is genuinely strange in the best possible way. The Aztecs and the Maya were not the same people. They did not speak the same language, worship exactly the same gods, or organize their societies in the same ways. They were distinct civilizations, separated by geography and culture, though connected by the broader Mesoamerican world in which both participated. Finding an Aztec-associated deity in a Maya sacred context, deposited as an offering in a cenote on the Yucatan Peninsula, is evidence of cultural contact and exchange at a depth that pure political or trade history doesn't fully capture. Someone brought this object to this place because it had meaning there, because the god it represented was relevant to the concerns of the people making the offering. Rain, water. The continuation of life in a landscape that was, in the 9th century AD, becoming terrifyingly unreliable in its provision of both. The 9th century drought, or more accurately the series of droughts that struck the Maya lowlands across roughly a century of climatic instability, is now understood to be one of the central pressures that drove the social and political changes of the classic Maya period's end. Paleoclimate data extracted from lake sediments, cave formations, and marine cores shows clearly that the period between roughly 800 and 1000 AD was marked by significantly reduced rainfall across the Yucatan and surrounding regions. For an agricultural civilization dependent on seasonal rains to grow maize on thin tropical soils, reduced rainfall was not an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. Crops failed, food stores ran low. The elaborate social contract that bound farmers to nobles to kings, a contract that depended on those kings being able to maintain the agricultural productivity that justified their political authority, began to fray. The cenote offerings from this period reflect that desperation with painful clarity. Increased frequency of deposits, more valuable objects surrendered. Broader repertoire of ritual practice, including the borrowing of religious imagery from other Mesoamerican traditions, hence the Tlaloc sculpture, in what reads as a theological casting of the net, a willingness to try approaches outside the established Maya ritual system if they might help bring the rain back. The stingray spines for bloodletting tell the same story from a different angle. Personal sacrifice, the offering of one's own blood as the most intimate possible petition to the gods. These were not routine rituals conducted in times of comfort. These were emergency measures, the spiritual equivalent of a distress call, conducted by people who were genuinely frightened about what was happening to their world. The traditional narrative of the Maya collapse presents this period as a sudden catastrophic ending. The great classic Maya cities abandoned, the population disappearing, the civilization going dark. It's a compelling story, simple and dramatic, and it is substantially wrong. The LIDAR survey of Tzeltal, the central settlement of the forgotten kingdom of Sakzi, a mid-sized Maya polity whose existence was barely known to researchers until recent work confirmed its location and scale, is one of the pieces of evidence that has helped researchers replace that simple story with a far more accurate and far more interesting one. LIDAR, light detection and ranging, fires rapid pulses of laser light at the ground from aircraft, measures the return time of reflections, and builds a precise three-dimensional model of the terrain below. In a jungle environment where dense canopy prevents aerial photography from seeing what lies beneath, LIDAR is transformative. It strips away the vegetation digitally, revealing the actual surface of the ground below, and in Maya territory, what that surface reveals is extraordinary. Beneath the trees of the Yucatan and neighboring regions, the LIDAR data shows not empty jungle, but the remains of a civilization that covered this landscape so thoroughly with architecture, agriculture, roads, reservoirs, and settlements that the idea of a sudden collapse becomes immediately implausible. You do not collapse and leave this much behind. The LIDAR data from Tzeltal revealed a city that was significantly larger and more architecturally ambitious than the surface evidence had suggested. Plazas, pyramidal platforms, residential compounds, causeways connecting different sections. Of the settlement, all of it laid out according to the spatial logic of classic Maya urban planning. And the evidence from this site, combined with data from dozens of other locations surveyed by LIDAR across the Maya world, tells a story of gradual transformation rather than sudden catastrophe. Some cities were abandoned, others were not. Political power shifted from the southern lowland centers to the northern Yucatan, to Chichen Itza, to Uxmal, to the cities of the Puk Hills, as the population adapted to changing conditions by moving toward areas with more reliable water access. The Maya didn't disappear. They relocated, reorganized, and rebuilt, and the civilization that emerged in the northern Yucatan in the centuries after the collapse was in many ways as sophisticated as what had preceded it. The kingdom of Sakzi is a particularly striking example of what Lidar is revealing about Maya political geography. It was a real polity. It appears in inscriptions from other Maya sites, referenced in political and diplomatic contexts, but its physical location had been essentially unknown to modern researchers. The LiDAR survey found it, defined its boundaries, and revealed the scale of its central settlement in a way that no amount of ground survey through dense jungle could have achieved in a comparable time frame. Lakanjatzeltal turns out to have been a substantial city, with monumental architecture and the spatial organization of a serious political center. It was not a village that happened to get mentioned in other sites' inscriptions. It was a kingdom capital, hiding in plain sight under the jungle canopy, waiting for the technology that could find it without cutting down every tree between here and the horizon. What the cenote archaeology and the LiDAR data together reveal about the Maya is something that gets lost in the dramatic collapse framing. This was a civilization of extraordinary resilience and adaptability. The 9th century droughts were devastating. The political structures of the classic period did not survive them intact. Major cities were abandoned, royal dynasties ended, the elaborate monument-building programs that had been the most visible expression of classic Maya political culture stopped. All of that is real, but the people did not disappear. The agricultural knowledge did not disappear. The religious traditions, modified, expanded, experimentally hybridized with outside influences as those cenote offerings demonstrate, did not disappear. The Maya language and its many regional variants did not disappear. What happened was a transformation, painful and disruptive, and in many individual cases catastrophic, but ultimately a transformation rather than an ending. The descendants of the classic Maya are not a historical memory, they are living people. There are roughly 7 million people alive today who identify as Maya, speaking Maya languages, maintaining cultural traditions, and inhabiting the same Yucatan Peninsula and surrounding regions where their ancestors built the cities that Lidar is. Now mapping from the air. The mystery of the Maya collapse has always been slightly misconceived as a question, because it frames the end of a specific political and architectural phase as the end of a civilization, when what actually happened is that a civilization encountered extraordinary stress, lost some of what it had built, and continued. Which is what civilizations do, which is what human beings do. The cenotes remain central to that continuity in ways that are both practical and symbolic. They are still the primary freshwater source in much of the Yucatan. They are still considered sacred in Maya spiritual tradition. The underwater archaeology conducted in them is done in consultation with Maya communities who maintain a living relationship with these sites, not as museum artifacts of a vanished culture, but as active components of a world that is still in use. The skull with the trauma marks and the Tlaloc sculpture and the stingray spines were deposited by people whose descendants are still here, still connected to the same landscape, still drawing water from the same underground network that their ancestors called the mouth of the underworld. That is the note on which this entire journey through drowned history ends, not with the discovery of a lost civilization, sealed away in amber and disconnected from the present, but with evidence of continuity. The ancient world didn't vanish. It transformed, it adapted, it survived in forms we don't always recognize as descended from what came before. The ships at the bottom of the Mediterranean, the fortresses under Lake Nasser, the Roman resorts sinking slowly into the Bay of Naples, the Viking buried in his longship, all of these are evidence not of endings but of transitions. History doesn't stop, it just keeps going, often underwater, waiting for us to drain enough of the ocean to see what's really there.